Hi everybody, thanks very much for coming today. Super excited to have this wonderful group of people with us today to talk about managing alcohol content. I am very excited to have everybody that I've got here today in the same chat. First we've got Greg Howell joining us. He's the Managing Director of Essentials Laboratories. They have laboratories in Victoria, West Australia, Queensland, New South Wales and Tassie. And Greg's joining us today from the Gold Coast. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Claire. Hi, everybody.
I've got Daniel McCulloch. He's joining us from Adelaide today, and he's the APAC Technical Manager at Lallemand. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
It's worth saying as well that Daniel and Greg are also my fellow colleagues at BERA, Interlaboratory Proficiency Scheme. I've got Anthony Clem joining us. He's from the Quality Project Group, IBA, but also is Brew consultant. Anthony's previously been the head brewer at Hemingway Brewery and also did some time at Lion in a quality role. And he's joining us from Brisbane today. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Claire. Hey, everyone.
Hey, and finally, I'm very excited to say we've got Caroline Hill here, who's the Risk Treatment Lead for Alcohol at the ATO. And she's joining us from Adelaide. Hi, Caroline.
Hello, everybody.
And so I've got a short statement that I'm going to read on behalf of Caroline and the ATO, just so that she can join us today. So the ATO does not endorse the policies of the Independent Brewers Association or the products or services of the other presenters at this webinar. Is that okay, Caroline? Did I do that all right?
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I thought we'd start today with just a little bit of an introduction on where the guidelines are with terms of alcohol. So we've got the live chat going if anybody's got any questions. So just put those down and we'll try and answer them as we go. But Caroline, I'd like to start with, if you could start today with of what the main standards are in terms of alcohol and accuracy to please, for the ATO.
Sure. So from an ATO perspective, the rules in relation to measuring alcoholic strength are set out in the legislative determination. That information can also be found on our ATO website and also located in the excise guidelines for the alcohol industry. So it's replicated in several spots. Basically, the main rule is that the equipment used must produce an accurate result. And then obviously there's some equipment that's set out in the determination that is considered to be suitable. The determination was reviewed in 2019 and it then placed a lot of focus onto the rules that are already in existence by the National Measurement Institute around strength testing.
And I'm looking here at the, so we're allowed, according to the ATO, up to 0.2% alcohol by volume compared to the label. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So the determination sets out the rules in relation to the tolerance. So if you are producing a product and you're putting it into a container with a label on it, that tolerance is 0.2%, but for beer subject to secondary fermentation, it's 0.3.
Okay, so you've hit on a point that I was quite interested in, I wanted to ask you about today. Is that products that are subject to secondary fermentation? So how would you define a beer subject to secondary fermentation? I was wondering about this.
Traditionally, we've defined that as a product that has a minimal amount of sugar or yeast added at the packaging stage, where it will then be held back and not released to market, say perhaps for 14 days or so. That's traditionally what we've referred to beer as undergoing secondary fermentation as being.
Right, okay, so it's more intentional secondary fermentation as opposed to accidental secondary fermentation?
Yes.
Right, okay, thank you for clearing that up. And just to double check as well, you guys are not interested to a certain extent in ABVs that fall below the labelled amount. So say, for instance, we're making a 5% beer and it comes in at 4.3. That's something that the ATO isn't interested in.
Not specifically, because the rules in the determination say that the excise duty is paid on the actual or the labelled strength, whichever is the higher. And then when you go over, if your beer goes over the labelled strength, that's when the 0.2% to 0.2 percentage point tolerance kicks in. But if the actual strength is lower than the labelled strength, then the excise duty payable is the labelled strength.
Right, yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for that. And I think it's worth saying as well that we are governed by FSANs also, who have their own specification for how far a beer should be below or above the declared ABV. And my understanding, Anthony, you'll be able to back me up here, is you're allowed 0.3% above and 0.3% below ABV. Is that how you understand it?
That's my understanding as well, Claire.
Right.
Yeah, they hide it in a table, but as far as I understand, it's about 0.3 above and below.
So taking into account the ATO, if we're combining ATO and FSANs, we're looking at an upper spec of 0.2 and a lower spec of 0.3 to be within both those standards, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, lovely. Well, thank you for that. And I wanted to actually talk to you, Anthony, a little bit about brewing and what we should do if our ABVs are out. So from the position of a brewer, if you have beers that are above or below, do you have some advice about what you should do?
Yeah, I guess it gets a little bit more difficult in the craft world. If you're one of the bigger players, the tradition would be to blend with another like beer. Most likely it's the same beer of a lower strength to meet your alcohol, whether that be above or below. And the same can be done in the craft industry as well. The more vessels you've got, obviously, the better access you've got to two of the same styles of beer that you're producing and trying to pack. So if you are, particularly if you're on the high side, one of the other options is if you're just on the high side, you can dilute slightly with some deaerated water. Obviously, introduction of oxygen is detrimental to beer. We've done another best practice guide on that. But if you can create some deaerated water by carbonating some sterile water and diluting, then that can bring you down. On the low side, there are some options as well. If you can add alcohol, and we were just talking about this earlier, you can add alcohol up to 0.5% of the label volume. So if you are just on the low side and you can add some alcohol, whether that be 95 beverage grade, as my understanding is, you can just bump it up very slightly, but it must not go over 0.5% alcohol. Yeah. Caroline can probably confirm that for me, but you are not really left with too many options. Ideally, if you're batch brewing and you really need to hit your specs, you've got to be all over your process. So, it's most craft brewers would probably attest to saying, "Oh, we can't blend. We don't have a blend station like you would have in a big brewery." So it is challenging, obviously, to blend, and logistically, it's potentially a nightmare for the craft guys. But if you've got a really important run and you've pre-printed packaging and lots of packaging for it, I think we're getting to a stage now where we are going to be punished a lot more if you are significantly out of spec for alcohol. So to make the time to blend or dilute or slightly increase to make those changes is a good option. one of the other options, if you're really tracking your alcohol through the process, and you've got and you think you're going to be very low, so you've done an attenuation limit, for example, and you think you're going to be you're going to be very low on your alcohol. There is an opportunity to add some sugar during fermentation in the form of dextrose or sucrose. You're adding a known quantity. You're calculating it, and that gives you a little bit of leeway to push the alcohol up and then into spec. So I think it's probably good practice, especially from a sort of, what's the word? From a consumer perspective, we really don't want to be putting alcohol. We don't want to be putting beer out into the market that's very high in alcohol. It's going to send mistrust to our consumers.
Pre-packaged, you need to be really assertive about checking your beer throughout its fermentation, having a backup plan. Would you say would be good practice to perhaps even sort of target going to the lower end of specification just to be on the safe side? Or do you think that's not necessary?
It depends on how, from my perspective, it depends on how much control or how much trust you have in your own processes as well. Like if you're brewing beers that, you brew day in, day out, and you're doing your attenuation limits, your mash profiles are spot on in your brew house, and you're really comfortable with where you're seeing those beers land, then you can target towards the middle of your specification and be comfortable in some variation. If you are brewing a beer for the first time, a limited release or something of that nature, you're doing a severe amount of dry hopping, or you're adding other extract that you wouldn't normally be familiar with or not add in the past, then absolutely, I think it's important to err on the safe side, go low, and then you're not having to, if you go high, if you haven't got access to deaerated water, it can be an absolute pain in the ass to dilute, obviously. But if you're erring on the low side and you're following your process, you'll have a fair indication of where it's going to end up. And if you really do need to push it up, then adding a small amount of dextrose throughout the ferment can get you there. Or post that, you may be able to add a little bit of alcohol. Obviously, that's not ideal either, but I still think erring on the low side is better. You've got a little bit more leeway, you've got less administration and more cost from a tax perspective on the high side, and more consumer issues on the high side as well. So you're releasing beers that are well out of spec on the high side is just building a mistrust, I think, in our consumer base.
It does. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in relation to the alcohol that can be added to beer, there are two different sections within the definition for beer. So one is where it talks about the addition of other substances, including flavours that contain alcohol. So that has a limit of 0.5%, adding a total of 0.5% to the total volume of the product. And then the other one is where the spirit is actually distilled from beer. And again, it's a 0.5% limit. So adds no more than 0.5% to the total volume.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. So that's interesting. You can also add amounts brew flavouring and then other extracts then. Okay. Thanks for that, Anthony. Actually, I was going to ask you and Daniel particularly about some of the areas in the brew house where we might run into some difficulties and not end up with the ABV that we're expecting. Some of the ones in particular I was interested in was around, controlling extract and actually understanding the amount of fermentable sugars you're starting off with. Daniel, did you have any comments on, making sure that you're actually accurately calculating the amount of fermentable sugars at the start?
Yeah, well, I mean, testing temperatures, making sure that mash temp is what you think your mash temp is. Making sure you're doing iodine tests for conversion. Making sure that your instruments are calibrated, that you're reading, and then during fermentation, doing false ferments and your attenuation limits to see where you are, understanding your certificates of analysis of your malt that's coming in. When you're doing some more and crazy styles, like if you're doing brewed IPAs or something, understanding the enzymes that you're adding. And then when it gets into fermentation, it's fruits and other things that are added. And then also, contamination risks such as diastaticus, which is going to create your glucoamylase that's going to break down residual sugars, or even strains such as Saccharomyces longus that can ferment dextrins.
That's a good point. And with a lot of the beers that we're seeing that are being above the declared ABV, I wonder how many of them are down to adding novel ingredients such as fruit and other adjuncts. Anthony, do you think it's quite a challenge as a brewer to figure out how much fermentable sugar you've got? Are there any sort of tips and tricks for working this sort of thing out when you're making more of these interesting beers, with fruit purees and what have you?
It is a challenge. There's absolutely a lot going on. There's a lot of variables when you're brewing and you're trying to figure out exactly the amount of extract. I think one of the important factors that we really need to be on top of, particularly in the brew house, is just nailing your original extract. So getting that starting gravity or OE and making sure you are spot on where you want to be, so that your calculation sets you up for the best possible result in the end after complete fermentation. So, really focusing on getting into, as close as 0.1 away from your OE, your original starting gravity, is going to put you in a good spot to get you where you want to finish up. Tips and tricks on figuring out exactly how much extract you're putting in. I think if you're buying material from suppliers, really, you want to know the extract value in that material so that you can pre-calculate it going into your recipe. So before you even getting into the brew house and on brew day, you've put your recipe together. You've got all your information from your suppliers, including the amount of extract in each thing you're going to add, so that you can put that into your calculation. So already you're not just including your malt extract and all of that, you're including the other extract that is going to be fermentable in those raw materials. But it is still, I understand it is very challenging. There are a lot of variables, and particularly if we're dry hopping, I know we're seeing a lot of dry hopping through fermentation, and the dry hopping rates are very high. So, understanding the increases in carbohydrate that those dry hopping additions are adding is important. Like if you're seeing, even the smallest amount of addition increase that your OE or your gravity, then it's something worth considering. So erring on the low side is going to help you. And then analyses. I think you can't go past just getting your alcohol done if you're unsure of the amount of extract going into your beer. So if you're at a loss to how much extract's going in, then calculating it's not going to help you. So you really need to get it tested.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We see beers, that have added all sorts of things. I've seen ones with red, real fruit and that kind of thing. So maybe the advice there is to hold off or printing packaging until you have a bit more of an idea where that's going to come out. I guess ideally as well, some sort of trial brew, maybe just a case to begin with, might not be a bad idea in that instance.
Absolutely. I think if you can do a couple of test brews on a smaller scale, get them analysed, understand where they're going to end up before you print your packaging, you're going to put yourself in a bit of a better situation, aren't you?
Definitely. And Dan, you touched on diastaticus. So what sort of pitfalls are there in there that, you could unintentionally come across in the brew house?
Well, I mean, most of your saison styles in the market are diastaticus yeast. So a lot of the time it could be cross-contamination of that particular strain. Years ago, I remember identifying a sporulating diastaticus on malt dust that was in the mill room of the brewery that I used to work for. It is around, it is prevalent. It can come from contamination of different yeast cultures as well. Like we have a very high certificate of analysis in our yeast, for example, where we're testing STA 1, 2, and 3. And there are simple methods out there like the Durham test to be able to look to see if you have a diastaticus contamination. In the process, forced ferments are also another way to see where that's going to attenuate. And speeding those up is quite easy if you put those into an incubator. Even up to 37 Celsius, you can get quite a quick result if you've got a large diastaticus contamination.
Okay, well, thank you. That's interesting. And if people want more information on that, is there somewhere they can go and look to find it?
Yeah, I mean, just on the Durham tube, we have a best practice for that on our website. Or people can email me. I did a presentation, I think, in 2019 on diastaticus and wild yeast testing methods. That should be on the IBA portal. We've also got the IBA forum up and running now, so anyone can ask some questions and we can share methods through that resource as well.
Excellent. And on the fermentation front, I guess there's potentially a couple of pitfalls there, Anthony, on things around yeast health and oxygen that could lead to ABV discrepancies down the track.
Absolutely. A lot of what we're doing, I know it's a lot of fun in the brew house, and I think every brewer enjoys being in the brew house, but a lot of what we do is in fermentation. So really important to just ensure you're oxygenating at the right levels. So if you're over oxygenating, Dan knows what happens. You make more yeast, and so that's actually using nutrients and extract in the beer to reproduce rather than to produce ethanol. So if you're excessively oxygenating, then you can fall down that path, and you'll probably notice that if you're cropping an excessive amount of yeast off vessels that you're not used to seeing, that can often be an indicator of over oxygenation. And the other end of the spectrum, under oxygenation, you have slow ferments, and under attenuations, things just don't kick off very quickly. You don't get your cell numbers in the first 24 hours. It's taking a bit longer, and you're not getting that full attenuation. So potentially you're leaving a lot of residual sugar that you've converted during the brew house during mashing, but you're leaving a lot of residual sugar there that's then available for other organisms, especially if you're under pitching. If you're not getting those cell numbers up, the yeast may not be able to outcompete some other contamination that you may have had, and therefore you've got something else going on in the ferment. Also, I guess from a fermentation perspective, if you're brewing with lots of adjuncts as well, if you don't have enough free amino nitrogen for yeast health and activity, you can see some sluggish ferments and under attenuations there. So be careful that you're adding enough yeast nutrient like zinc sulfate, and if there's not enough nitrogen, that you're substituting with other nitrogen, like diammonium phosphate or some other products that are pretty well known out on the market now. So there are options to to make sure that yeast health is there, they're readily available. So yeah, just be aware that if you haven't got enough free amino nitrogen, you're not adding yeast nutrient or those types of things, that you can see sluggish fermentations, which means it could lead to a fair amount of residual sugar, which opens yourself up to secondary fermentation down the track. If you're not pasteurising your beers, then you've got live yeasts. They can be wild yeasts. If you've been using saisons, and you've got yeast that can consume maltotriose and other dextrins as well. So you've really got to be careful that you're managing yeast health throughout the process. It's a really important part. Brewhouse is fun, but fermentation, there's a lot going on in there, and managing yeast health is a really important factor.
I've definitely seen a lot of stuck fermentations recently, and that we've been using a bit of yeast life extra to fix those stuck fermentations. So mixing that up and adding that into the tank. But definitely nutrition's a big part. The yeast isn't going to get there if it doesn't have the nutrition. It won't be able to get all the way through its metabolic pathway to get to that final step of ethanol. You probably see a bit of acetyldehyde, so green apple kind of off flavour in those beers as well, where that hasn't been converted into ethanol.
Yep. Okay.
Again, forced fermentations are going to assist with that. So if you're doing forced fermentations to get that attenuation when you're adding any other things into the beer, you should be doing another forced fermentation to see where it can finally get to.
Yeah.
I think forced fermentation is a good one. It's a relatively easy test. It's not going to give you exact figures every time, but I mean, the more you do, the more you understand, what you're doing in the brew house is actually reproducible. So, it gives you a bit more confidence in your brew house and your processes in there as well. Pardon me.
Maybe that's something we can look to include as the quality project group, as some kind of fact sheet in the future on that. I think that would be definitely something worthwhile sharing. Thank you for definitely secondary fermentation and recent recalls are not things that we want to see. So you make good points on all of those. I wanted to also talk about then measuring your alcohol and your OE in the brew house. So I want to bring Greg into this conversation. There's obviously quite a few different methods that you can use, Greg, to measure your extract and your alcohol, all different sort of levels of cost as well associated. What are your thoughts on some of the cheaper methods to use for smaller startup breweries and how accurate they may be?
That's a good question, Claire. Thank you. It's tricky. I mean, and generally, as you know, I've been running beverage laboratories for over 25 years, and we started out pretty small. We were doing things in a pretty simple way. But generally, the more you pay, the more accurate you are. And nowadays, we use near infrared. I won't mention the brand name, but it's a pretty popular one. So in our 4 laboratories, sorry to correct you, we don't have a lab in Queensland. In our 4 labs, we have the same instruments throughout those 4 laboratories. And they're near infrared alkalizer is a brand name, but yeah, they're those instruments. But they're very expensive and certainly out of reach of most craft brewers in my mind. Obviously using a hydrometer is the cheapest and the simplest way to go, but it's not necessarily the most accurate. And one thing that we're probably going to talk about later, how do you validate stuff? We run NATA accredited laboratories. So we're accredited to ISO International Standard 17025, which is a quality management system for laboratories. As part of that, we have to calibrate every measuring device we have, which includes hydrometers. Now, to calibrate a hydrometer, it sounds quite simple, but it's actually quite complex. Well, it's a bit of effort, I should say. We actually have to have reference thermometers hydrometers that come with a certificate of analysis to say how accurate they are. And then we use them to check our working hydrometers. So to be a NATO accredited lab, that's what you actually have to do. One of the problems with hydrometers is they normally have a paper scale on the inside of the glass tube, and those scales can actually move. So it is actually very important to check the calibration of a hydrometer. It's a pretty simple way to do it. You make up sucrose solutions of varying concentrations that then you can measure, you can check, what the result should be, and you can use your hydrometers to check that. So that is actually a very important thing to do. So hydrometers can be accurate, but they need to be looked after. And the important thing is that the temperature needs to be controlled as well. So the results will vary with temperature. One method that is a bit messy, but also quite accurate, is using distillation. So distilling the sample first and then measuring the density in some way. And that's been used for a very long time in the wine industry, which is where I've come from. It is actually the international reference method. So that's a cheap way to go. Everybody knows what hydrometers cost to get a setup for distillation. Again, without giving myself a free plug, we sell this kind of gear, but it's probably less than $1,000 to get set up for a distillation hydrometry setup. The only issue is you do, again, need to be accurate with your temperature measurement. Now that, to buy a water bath is actually quite expensive, a temperature controlled water bath. But if you can set up a lab with air conditioning so that you actually set it to 20 degrees in that room you're doing it in and give time for the sample to equilibrate, then you can get quite accurate results with that. They're probably the two cheapest and easiest ways to measure alcohol accurately. There's lots of more expensive ways, and I'm sure there'll be someone out there who wants to sell you an instrument for $100,000, but I'm not recommending that for anybody. But there's lots of different ways to skin that cat.
It's interesting you say about the air conditioner. That's exactly what we do here. That's good advice. So with the hydrometers, how frequently would you recommend labs sort of calibrate and just check on that their hydrometer is reading correctly?
Well, we do that annually. Again, we've got to go by the NATO rules, and we have to calibrate ours thoroughly every 12 months. The reference hydrometers that we have that are just another hydrometer, but they cost hundreds of dollars to get calibrated. I think NMI might do that. I forget exactly where you get that done, but I can find out for anybody if they're interested. We have to get those done every 5 years. Now, the other thing is, if your hydrometer isn't reading accurately, then again, and this is what NATO insists, then you've got to use a correction factor. So say it's at 0.1 when you're using it to calibrate, then every measurement you do, you've got to actually add 0.1 to it. Now, that's can be quite cumbersome. There's ways around it, but you just got to be very careful with that.
Okay, so this brings me on to my next question then. So if you were looking at sort of a medium budget, what would be your picks of things to consider, to make life a little bit easier? Talking sort of mid-range, anything from sort of 2,500 up to 20,000 budget.
If you've got the budget, the near-infrared analyzer is the best way to go. They're very accurate. Again, they've got to be calibrated. Again, you've got to be careful with them. They're just not a black box. You can just spit numbers out. You've actually got to look after them. And you've got to use standard materials with them to make sure they're actually recording correctly. For example, with all of our wine work, we actually keep a cask of wine as what we call a secondary standard, and we measure that every day. Now, cask wine, you can take material out and the material left doesn't degrade, which is the beauty of that, using that. But that's obviously at a higher level, typically 10 to 12% compared to most beers. if you haven't got that sort of budget, what we're actually looking at, and we haven't come to a firm conclusion, but it's looking very positive, is using a spectrophotometer. Now, spectrophotometers only cost a couple of $1,000s. They're very versatile, and you can do a number of different measurements with them, such as sugars, free amino nitrogen, colour, bitterness, etc. So if you want to do bitterness, you need to buy UV vis. They're a bit dearer, 4,000, something like that. So we've been actually working with enzymatic test kits for ethanol recently, just to check how accurate they are. Now, we have found one that we think is about plus or minus 0.1, but we haven't finished the work on that. If that proves to be fine, then they're actually very easy to use with a little bit of training. All you notice is a spectrophotometer. If you can use a micro pipette and you've got a bit of time, then they are very accurate. I mean, they're widely used in the wine industry. There are some automated examples I've seen in the craft beer space, but some of them are a little bit problematic with the accuracy. But they're the two best. They're the two best options. We have imported and sold bulliometers for decades to the wine industry. I don't recommend them. They really aren't accurate enough for what Caroline's been saying the tolerances are for beer. They're not actually designed for beer. They work fine if you have a pure water ethanol mixture. As soon as you have other materials in the solution, like you do in beer, then you get less accuracy. So I don't recommend them. In fact, I don't recommend them to the wine industry, but the tolerance in the wine industry is plus or minus 0.75. So you can really drive a truck through that specification that you can't do in the craft beer industry.
Yeah.
They really, I think, are the main options available. And of course, the other option, and I know you've mentioned this, and this is actually what we do, is, and Anthony said it before, you can actually send a sample out for testing. Now, we test, we need, I think, 50 ml of sample, and we charge, I think it's about $25 for an alcohol analysis, and that comes with a NATA certificate. So you know it's actually absolutely correct. So that is another option for people. I mean, it can be a very cheap option, depending on the number of batches that you're making. But the benefit of that is the certainty. You know exactly what you get is exactly right.
Yeah.
I know we're going to talk about other stuff later, but we need to cover on what beer does at some stage as well, in my opinion.
Well, and I was going to say, if you wanted to check the certainty of your method, if you're calculating, there's nothing like sending a sample off to a NATA accredited laboratory either, just to see how your results stack up against those results. Daniel, I know we've had a conversation about this, and I wanted to ask you, because you're out in the field a lot, visiting lots of breweries. There's always pros and cons to using some of the smaller alcohol analyzers and handheld density meters and that sort of thing. What should people consider before they move from a hydrometer and calculation and spend the extra money and get themselves a small alkalizer? What would you advise people take into account before they take that leap?
I think it's very crucial, the filtration for all these instruments. The same with using a hydrometer and removing CO2. They're all about sample prep. Whether you're adding some filter aids to those samples to make it a bit accurate, whether, with density meters, you're just using coffee filters, whether the NRI instruments out there, you're using maybe a first grade filter paper number 1 and then a GC50 glass fiber. Below that, whether using 0.5 membranes and vacuum pumps to really take out all of the things in beer to assist in making these measurements more accurate. There is quite a few different companies out there with these NRI units. I think, again, cleaning is a huge part. So, in any of those density or other NRI instruments out there, they've really got to be cleaned. You're putting, obviously, beer through there that's open to the air, so you're adding in different bacteria and things that can build up and make those instruments inaccurate. So regular cleaning, when I used to use an NIR unit, I'd make sure that we had a standard beer. So a large brewery's beer, we'd buy a case of that and we would run that as part of our check, as well as all the cleaning and other checks the units have. But I think, filtration is definitely one of the challenges for these instruments. And again, especially with any of the density levels, you should be filtering it at the start and filtering at the end of the brew and the fermentation to ensure you're getting an accurate result. And also periodically sending away to check, or being part of something like Beer Up.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe it's a good time to talk Beerer. On that note, Greg mentioned it. So, Greg, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what Beerer do exactly?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And I'm preaching to two converted here because you're both on the committee as well. Interestingly, when we get NATA audits, and we get them every 18 months of our laboratories, one of the first things that the NATA auditor will ask is to look at our proficiency program results. And for the beer testing that we do, NATA now accepted Beerer is the authority on this. A proficiency testing program such as Beerer, and don't forget, beer is all voluntary, so it's we're working on improving what we do, but I think what we do with a small committee is very good. What you're doing is you're getting a couple of different beers that you test in your own brewery by whatever means you want, and I'll use alcohol as the example, but there's a lot more tests you can do. You test it, you submit your results. It's all done anonymously. Nobody else sees what your results are. You're the only embarrassed one, if that's how it works out. All the results from all the participants are placed onto a chart, and basically what you're looking at is to see where you fit in that scatter diagram. Now, there's a particular chart that we use, and if you're in the middle of the pack, you've done very well. And the further you are from the pack, you need to review what your procedures are. So it's a great exercise. I mean, and I'm going to spruik beer. It's only, I think Daniel's a treasure, $150 a year to be a member. You get a number of rounds a year. And there's one underway at the moment. And you can do up to, I think it's 8 or 10 different tests that we offer that we compare. So it's a very simple way and a very important way for you to check that how your testing is actually going. With what we have to do for NATA, we have a corrective action system with our laboratories. If we are more than 2 standard deviations from the median on those results, then we have to do an investigation. So that's another good way to think about it. If you're 2 standard deviations away from the result, then you've got to reconsider how you're actually going about it. It's a very simple system. I mean, for people, for the members, all they've got to do, they get 2 samples of beer, they test it, they send the results in. That's all they've got to do, and then they get a chart to show where they are on that on the set of results for that particular test. Another important thing to do is if you're not trying to get the best result out of your laboratory, you're trying to get, dare I say it, the worst result out of your laboratory. So if anybody's working in your lab, you don't want to get the best person to be doing this. You want to get everybody to be doing this. And so one round you might get one person, and the next round you get the other person who works in your lab, because you're trying to find to see if you're actually doing it properly whenever you do it. So it's quite a simple, foolproof system, and it gives you some very solid feedback. The people on the committee, Dan, Claire, a couple of others, they're very experienced, and we're very open to helping people if they do end up having problems. So it's a very useful situation, and it's very inexpensive. I know there are other systems around the world that are much dearer than what beer is, and it's really, I guess, because of we try to cut costs and do it all voluntarily, and people like Claire donate the beer. so that we have very low costs of running the system. So it's very good.
Thank you. And I guess my final question is to you, Caroline, and it is sort of around the testing thing. So I just wondered if you could clarify a point in the ATO standard around what happens to businesses that start to produce over 100,000 litres with regards to, I'll give you the example, we might have a lab, a brewery that's using a calculation and a hydrometer, and then they go over the 100,000 litre mark. Well, what's the ATO guidance for them in terms of what they should be doing for measurement?
Yes, so under the determination, if you produce less than 100,000 litres in a financial year, you can use a hydrometer and formula to determine your alcoholic strength. That has to be in line with a documented testing process. So you need to have a documented testing process for how you do that, which would include perhaps some independent testing to confirm the accuracy of those that formula that you're using and the results you're getting. If you go over 100,000, then you're then required to look at the other methods of strength testing. One of the methods is, well, it's not really a method, but it says any other method that consistently produces a similar result to the other equipment, so and within a 0.2 tolerance. So if you were able to show that the formula and hydrometer that you've been using produces that accurate result within the 0.2 tolerance, then you have an argument to continue using that particular method.
Could it be something like comparing your results with the results of like a NATA accredited laboratory? How could you show your due diligence around that, around your methodology?
Yes, if you were to send it off to a NATA approved laboratory who did that independent testing for you, and then the results that you get back show that your strength determination is within 0.2 of what the NATA approved laboratory has reported back, and you did that for a number of products, then you could use that as your evidence that your method is accurate and within the 0.2.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for the clarification on that, because I've looked at it a few times. So now I know.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess the final sort of question, maybe Greg or Daniel might have the answer to this one. If budget is not an option, so this is a sort of a nice to have question, what would be the best place to spend your money to get great accuracy on alcohol testing?
I've probably spent more money than Daniel on these things, so maybe I can answer first. Certainly NIR is the way to go. It's very accurate. Daniel's quite right. You've got to be very careful how you use the instrument, including the sample preparation. But they really are and that's what we use. I mean, we've tried a number of different ways. We used to do it by HPLC, which is a lot more expensive. But if you use NIR, you can get results within a couple of minutes. But you do have to be careful that you do the daily checks that are recommended, that you do the sample preparation, and that you are running standards so that you know that what you are doing is actually accurate. It's very easy to say, I bought a new black box and it spits out a number, I'm just going to actually use that number. It's not quite that simple, but certainly they are the bee's knees. You can spend a lot more money on things like GCs, but it's not necessary. NIR that are set up for alcohol are really the best way to go.
Lovely, thank you. I concur. Thanks everybody, that's been fantastic. I'm sure there may even be some more questions, so if anybody has any questions off the back of this, as Daniel mentioned, we've got a chat or a question feature on the IBA website. You can also contact us at BERA. Plus, I'm excited to say that very shortly we'll have another best practice fact sheet up on the IBA website best practice alcohol compliance, and it will cover off a lot of the stuff we've talked about today, plus some extra stuff around brewing, some more pros and cons around instrumentation, so look out for that. And yeah, any feedback would be greatly appreciated. All right, thanks guys.
Thanks, Claire.